Though this letter is written directly to Titus and telling him what Paul's desire is for his ministry, we can also see that this seems with the language to be Paul's typical approach to what ministry would look like. Paul would travel and would preach and spread the gospel. Churches would become established. Then Paul would move on to other churches. We see even in his missionary journeys, he'd establish a church and then he'd move on. Then in the next missionary journey, and many times or on his way returning home, he would come back to those churches and help establish them. Paul didn't have an attitude with those churches of, well, once they got going, they were on their own. But he really took ownership for them. And we even see that as Paul lays out the burdens that he carries. He lays out the beatings he's received, the stonings, being shipwrecked. He lays out all these things. And at the end of that list, he says, and on top of all of these things, I bear the concern for each one of these churches. And so we see Paul's concern for the churches on the island of Crete in these standing orders that he gives to Titus. I left you there for a purpose, to set in order, to continue in the establishment and the deepening of these churches. And part of that process is by establishing elders in every city, as I directed you. That each congregation would have elder leadership, these under shepherds who would be helping to lead the body. We kind of see a threefold look at what that leadership would look like. First, the man has to be above reproach. And we see some things that are laid out to the man's character, how he handles his wife, how he handles his home, just a little bit about his reputation itself that's going to play into that. He has to be above reproach in those areas. He has to have a reputation that would not soil the church in the way that he interacts there. We also see then he says it again for the overseer, and the word overseer and elder and bishop, the presbyter, those can all be interchanged one for another as the same office. He says the overseer must be above reproach as God's steward. There's a second level to this, not just that the man ought to have good character so that he doesn't hurt the reputation of the church, but he also has to have such character. He has to be above reproach in such a way that it's trustworthy that he would be given the office to the church, that he would not be self-willed. He would not be using his office as an elder to accomplish his purposes. He would not be quick-tempered to where people in the congregation would not be able to interact with him, or addicted to wine, or pugnacious, or doing it for his own money, or anything like that. But then instead he switches the focus to characteristics he should have: hospitality, love, sensibility, just, devout, self-control. I think here we see another element of what the elder should look like. And honestly, when you go from either here in Titus or to the Timothy passages that lay out the requirements of an elder, you see that these things aren't really calling for anything above and beyond the norm for any other member of the congregation, that they would seek out those things as well. They would hunger and thirst for righteousness. And so the elder should be an example above reproach, so that people, the church's character is not soiled by his reputation. He needs to carry that example into the office of elder leadership so people can trust that he is leading the congregation for the purpose of their gain and for the growth of the church, and not just his own selfish purposes. And then lastly, I think verses 9 and it kind of helps lay out for us when we look at this: holding fast the faithful word which is in accordance with the teaching, so that you'll be able to both exhort in sound doctrine and refute those who contradict. Here's kind of where we see the difference that lays out where an elder does need to go above and beyond that of an other person in the congregation, and that he needs to know the Word of God well, and kind of in a two-armed attack at what his approach to the Word would be. That one, he needs to be able to teach it. He needs to be able to handle the Word in such a way that he can teach others from the Word of God. That's a key component in leading. This is how a servant leader works. You're not calling the person to follow yourself. You're calling them to follow Christ. And how do you get them to follow Christ? But by teaching them what the Word of God says, what Jesus has said. But in the midst of being able to teach, you're always going to find as well the need to refute those who contradict, to deal with those who misapply the Scriptures, misalign the Scriptures, or don't even know the Scriptures, and be able to point out their error. And Paul says to Titus, I've established these churches, and I'm moving on to other areas, and I'm not doing this and forgetting what's behind, but I left you there to help establish these churches. But quite frankly, the day is coming when Titus is no longer going to be there, and so they need elders established there. And in many ways, Greenville Grace is the same way. God is now left for us to have elders who lead the congregation, but one of the things the elders should have as a major goal for themselves is to know that the day is coming when they will not be here any longer. And so we need to be in the process of growing and maturing and developing and discipling other elders who will then follow in leading the sheep to see what the Word of God says.